It is my absolute pleasure right now to introduce our next speaker, who's going to be talking about mediation in the exam classroom, and that is Dr. Nathaniel Owen. So Nathaniel Owen is a senior research and analysis manager at Oxford University Press. He holds a PhD in language testing from the University of Leicester, specialising in L2 reading processes. His research interests and publications include the interface of language testing and technology, big data analytics, the use of language tests in English medium instruction contexts, research methods, widening participation in higher education. He's a very researching young man, and he has presented work at multiple national and international conferences, including Language Testing Forum, Language Testing Research Colloquium, and Association of Language Testers in Europe. But of course, of all of those conferences, the most important, he is with us here today. Hello, Nathaniel Owen.
Hi, Charlotte.
How are you doing? All right.
I'm not doing too bad. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Good. Well, we can hear you loud and clear. So the floor is yours.
Thanks, Charlotte. Thanks very much. And welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for attending this session this afternoon in UK time. But I can see from the comments that there are people from many different places around the world. So please do keep the comments coming. I can see them on my screen. And I will have access to the Q&A as well. So if you do have any questions at any point as we go into the session, I will have access to those. And we'll have a Q&A session at the end of this to try and make it a little bit more interactive. But first off, I thought that was a lovely introduction by Charlotte, but I will just add to it slightly and say that I began my professional life as an English language teacher, pretty much like everybody here today. And then I became very, very interested in assessments when I was teaching and decided ultimately to turn that into something of a career. So these days, yes, I do my work for Oxford University Press and work very much in designing, developing and researching language tests. And so today's session is perhaps more assessment focused than teaching focused. But perhaps assessment is something that you're really interested in or you've thought a lot about, and maybe it's something that you find frustrating, difficult. Maybe it's regarded as something that you feel you have to do, a hoop that you have to jump through rather than something that you're particularly passionate about. But I thought what I'll do today is to try and help you through this journey a little bit and understand a little bit more about assessment in general. And then also focusing on this word mediation. I don't know to what extent you're familiar with this word, but it sort of came to prominence, I think, with the publication of the Common European Framework of Reference companion volume around 2020. And then everybody suddenly started talking about mediation. It became perhaps something of a buzzword, lots of people talking about it, and then thinking, well, what does this word actually mean? What exactly do we mean by mediation? Why is this important? Why does it matter to me? And should I be doing anything with this? So without further ado, I think we'll just dive in and give you a bit of an overview as to what we're planning to look at today. So I want to position mediation with respect to the kind of traditional 4 skills understanding of teaching and learning. So if we think about reading, speaking, writing, and listening, what exactly is mediation in relation to this? And then we'll talk about that in relation to the CEFR and how to try and understand it a little bit better, why it matters to us, and then think a little bit more about practical implementation. So what does mediation look like, specifically from an assessment point of view? But I do believe that what we discussed today will have significant implications for classroom-based practice as well. And thinking a little bit more about what we understand by academic skills. So from the point of view of teaching, learning and assessment, we're perhaps thinking about slightly older cohorts headed towards higher education. That's sort of the context of thinking about mediation. And there is a reason for that, and we'll see that in relation to the CEFR as we progress.
From an assessment point of view, you're very familiar with, say, reading tests or writing tests or speaking tests or listening tests. Historically, these have been perhaps implemented individually. And probably the person who's more responsible for that than anybody else is the book on the left-hand side. So Robert Lado published a hugely influential book in 1961, actually. It's a very, very long time ago, which we can think of as the sort of birth of modern language testing. So language testing as a kind of discipline or a field has been around for a very long time, but its sort of modern genesis really occurred in relation to this book. And that's where people started thinking, okay, we assess these skills individually. And that model of assessment has perhaps been dominant ever since, and I would argue still is, to be honest. But so we think we're testing these things in isolation, although we're not really. If you think, for example, about a listening test, and these are often very, very dependent upon written input. So, for example, you have an audio that you listen to, but the questions for the audio are written. So there is nearly always a very, very significant reading component to a listening test. And that kind of thing can be quite difficult to get around. It would be very difficult to have a pure listening test in which the questions as well as the audio was only heard. That would create significant problems. So although we claim we test these things in isolation, there's often, what we consider to be construct contamination, really. Whereas an integrated skills approach to assessments, what we're thinking about really is a movement away from just thinking about skills in isolation and thinking about, well, can we actually assess these skills together? Should we assess these skills together? So in the example I just gave, for example, if there is a significant reading component in a listening test, perhaps we should consider assessing reading and listening in a sort of combined way. So we are thinking a little bit about not just assessing individual skills, but trying to take a slightly more holistic view of assessment. But integrated skills tasks usually go a little bit further than just that. And instead of just thinking about receptive skills like reading and listening, they often go towards, well, can we incorporate productive skills into a receptive skills test as well? So, for example, should we be assessing reading and writing simultaneously? And if so, how would we go about doing that? And that really is the implication of mediation in the CEFR. So if we are thinking about integrated skills from the point of view of, say, teaching and from the point of view of the Common European Framework of Reference, what that would look like in assessments is very usually a kind of integrated skills task. So integrated skills tasks have been around a lot longer than the CEFR, but with the publication of the CEFR in 2020, or the companion volume in particular, integrated skills tasks have received a renewed focus as a means of assessing mediation. And so if we think, there's a couple of examples on screen now of like definitions of integrated skills tasks, which predate the companion volume in the CEFR. And you can see they're very much about looking at source materials, whether text or whether listening materials, and then trying to use these to think about, well, how can these influence test takers in terms of subsequent performance in, say, spoken and written domains. Full quotations there, a couple of useful definitions, particularly the second one with respect to what a truly integrated task ought to look like. So an integrated task definitely requires a lot of input, whether that's audio or written. So that's a fairly substantial amount of input. And then a subsequent task must require transforming the language from the source. Now, if you think about your own practice, your own classroom-based practice in particular, undoubtedly, you all already do some kind of mediation, some kind of integrated skills activities within your classes. For example, whenever you're maybe working with a text, with a reading activity in class, it's very rare, and you're probably not going to just give the reading activity to the students and then give them some questions and say, right, read the text and answer the questions. That, I think, is widely regarded as poor practice in this day and age. Instead, you've probably heard quite a lot about activation of schemata or activating schema theory. So maybe, for example, you have some keywords on the board, and you're introducing some vocabulary to students. And you're using this as the basis of discussing what you're going to read. And so what you've got there really is a kind of integrated skills activity, which goes from speaking into reading, for example. And then maybe once the reading activity is complete, and maybe there have been some comprehension questions, maybe you have some kind of writing activity afterwards on the basis of the reading. I imagine this is all fairly bread and butter stuff to you. It's all fairly fundamental to what you do. In which case, you can say, fantastic, I'm already doing mediation. I'm already doing integrated skills. And that's great. From a teaching and learning point of view, fantastic. But from an assessment point of view, we don't usually or don't often assess integrated skills activities. It can be a lot harder to actually implement an integrated skills assessment than an integrated skills activity in a classroom. And so hopefully what we'll look at today will maybe demystify this process a little bit. So where did all this come from? Why did people start talking about mediation? And really, as I said, it comes from the CEFR, the Common European Framework of Reference, companion volume, which was published in around 2020. And the way the CEFR positioned mediation was alongside existing skills. Note that the CEFR does not talk about reading, speaking, writing, and listening as such. Instead, they talk about reception, production, interaction, and then this big thing that we're discussing today, which is mediation. And of those four skills, mediation is perhaps the one that needs the most attention. The others we can look at and say, okay, I understand what that is. Reception traditionally refers to reading and listening. Production traditionally refers to reading and writing. Interaction, this is a kind of online mode of discourse, usually thinking about speaking and writing. But where does mediation sit in relation to all of this? Well, mediation is sort of the interaction point between all of these skills. So if we think about reception and production, we can sort of position mediation between those a little bit. So it's very difficult to think of mediation as something which stands on its own as a kind of fourth skill. So potentially that could be a little bit misleading. So if we think about mediation, an actual fact, mediation requires the use of production. So when we are mediating something, we are producing language in some way, whether spoken or written. And also, we have input, as we saw from that quote from Nyok and Stilleborn from 2013. There must be some kind of input as well. So mediation, by necessity, involves both reception and production. So it's very, very difficult to think of mediation as something which exists independently of these two other modes. Now, what you also saw from that previous diagram is that all four modes of language use have two subcategories, which was kind of activities and strategies. So if we look at mediation in a little bit more detail, yes, mediation has activities and strategies. So with respect to the CEFR, what they call activities is kind of mediation use. So where, what, and what is being mediated. So these are the kind of activities and the domain of use of mediation. Whereas mediation strategies is very much, how do we do this? How do we go about mediating something? And what I'd like to talk about now is, from our point of view at OUP, when developing, say, language assessment tasks to focus on mediation, which don't necessarily focus just on reading, speaking, writing, and listening. This was something that was very new for us because mediation, of course, is quite a new concept that was introduced in the CEFR. So even though integrated skills, or the concept of integrated skills, predates this, we wanted to think about mediation in a lot more depth and the relationship between mediation and integrated skills. So what we did personally is to think about, well, where do we want mediation to exist within an existing test that we wanted to work with? And then how could we go about understanding mediation in a lot more detail? So the first thing we did is to identify all of the kind of subcategories within mediation, within the Common European Framework, and extract all of the descriptors that we thought were relevant to us. And so all of these concepts, these descriptors, these can-do statements which exist in the Common European Framework, we took all of those and then tried to understand what we thought mediation should look like in a little bit more. And this is very interesting. If you want to read the Common European Framework, I don't know how many of you have read the Common European Framework, then I think, well, do please do so. Do engage with the Common European Framework. But it may drive you a little bit crazy at the same time. It's something that is both, certainly from my point of view, inspirational and a little bit infuriating. So it's very, very, very patchy, and so sometimes it can be very, very useful and very illuminating, but other times can potentially be misleading. So you must be aware and be careful about how you use the Common European Framework. So when we started looking at these descriptors and thinking, well, how does this relate to what we want to assess? We looked at all these verbs, and again, these verbs are perhaps familiar to you. So we've got paraphrase, make easier, identify, convey, summarize, make accessible, edit, explain. So these are all descriptors from mediation, the mediation components of the CFR. And as you can see, we only looked at B1 through to C2. And some of these language proficiencies seem to exist across the CFR, whereas others are very much centered on a few specific levels of the CFR. So, for example, convey meaning. This is quite a broad term, and this apparently is something that is right across levels from B1 to C2. Similarly, summarize. That's actually really important, and this was something that influenced us enormously. Summarizing is a skill which is actually very present in the CFR, and perhaps from a point of view of assessments, is not very present. So think about this. Think about your own assessment practices. When was the last time you had a summary activity in a test that you put to your students? Maybe it's not something that you've done before, or even thought about doing before, or even thought, well, is this something that actually should be done? If I'm getting my students to write, maybe I want them to write an essay, or I want them to write a piece of prose. Summarizing is not something that necessarily is an activity I've considered for an assessment. Or maybe it's not even something you've considered as part of classroom-based activity as well. But then the CFR can be quite patchy in other ways. So whereas, for example, summarizing extends across the CFR, paraphrasing does not. Paraphrasing, for some reason, is a skill centered at B1, B1+, then disappears completely at B2, and then comes back again at C1. I can't explain that. I'm not sure why that is the case, but surely paraphrasing is absolutely essential to summarizing. How do you summarize something effectively without paraphrasing some content given to you? Obviously, there's more to summarizing than just paraphrasing, but is paraphrasing not a crucial component of summarizing? So why does that happen? I'm not sure. So again, it's a good example of why the CFR is perhaps partial in its coverage of, say, can-do descriptors. The next thing we encountered that was very strange indeed was because the CFR companion volume also introduced the plus levels into a common usage. So the B1 plus and the B2 plus, sort of dividing the 6 levels into sub-levels each. We noticed that actually B2 plus had been specified in a very idiosyncratic way, which divided it off and separated it from other CFR levels. So can-do statements such as simplify, clarify, comparing, contrast, synthesizing, and making inferences only appear at B2 plus and nowhere else at all. And again, very, very strange. But then we found this, which was also particularly useful and influential for us. Other words which we thought were particularly important: adapt, interpret, facilitate understanding, reorganize, redraft, and reconstruct. Crucial words for mediation construct. And these appeared almost exclusively at C1 and C2 levels. And so this was very, very useful for us because this led us to think, well, actually, mediation could be a very, very good way from an assessment point of view of, say, distinguishing B2 learners from C1 learners. So often trying to get at the kind of B2 C1 boundary from an assessment point of view can be very difficult, very challenging. For example, in a traditional essay, what do you expect to see at C1 that you don't necessarily see at B2 plus? That can be quite hard to get at. Whereas suddenly the introduction of mediation has given us a tool for actually thinking, okay, there's an opportunity here to think about, well, how can we differentiate B2 from C1, but maybe in a slightly different way to the traditional essay. And so that's what we did. And here are some descriptors. So if you're not familiar with the CFR, I've just put a couple of descriptors on screen to make this conversation seem a little bit more real. So, as I said, there's kind of overall mediation descriptors, and there are these kind of subcategories of descriptors within the CFR as well. So the overall one, and this is a kind of C1 level descriptor, so can convey clearly and fluently in well-structured language the significant ideas in long, complex texts, whether or not they relate to their own field of interest, including evaluative aspects and most nuances. So there's a lot going on there. And as you can see, when we were thinking about this in a lot of detail, we've sort of broken it down, and we color-coded a lot of the content of these descriptors as well. So the verbs, for example, you can see in orange. In blue, what we've got there is kind of the artifact or the thing, the object, which is being engaged with. So long, complex texts, which seem to be repeated quite frequently across mediation descriptors, especially at C1 level. And then in the green, what we've got are the kind of text genres, really, and any information related to genre. So articles, novels, editorials, literary reviews, extracts from scientific textbooks. And as you can see in the first descriptor, whether or not they relate to your own field of interest. So at this point, apparently in C1, test takers or students, learners, should be able to deal with more longer or complex texts which are outside of their own expertise, supposedly. And then in purple, what we've got is other information which relates to the style of the content as well. So in this case, we've got the evaluative, the nuanced content, and then it also mentions style and register. So the CFR is proposing or supposing that the inputs into any kind of activity or test task at this level will have a specific voice, will have a specific style, will have a specific register. So there's quite a lot of information that you can pull out of these descriptors, really. So they are worth engaging in a little bit. And so what does all of this mean? So what did we do with this information? And how can this help you? So we looked at the literature around integrated skills, which I showed you earlier, from maybe around 2013. And we looked at all of this content from the CFR as well. And thought, well, how can we sort of get at mediation from an assessment point of view, integrated skills tasks from all of this? And so here are some kinds of integrated skills tasks, which you may or may not be familiar with. So probably the most common example of an integrated skills task is the one on the left-hand side there, reading into writing. So this is an example whereby your test takers are given some input, whether it be a lengthy text or a short text, and then they have to do something with that. So instead of just writing an essay with minimal input, in which case the test takers are required to use their own knowledge, their own information, their own understanding of a topic, in an integrated skills task, they're required to manipulate and use the input in some way. Similarly, another alternative is listening into speaking. Same principle, same idea. So test takers listen to something, they hear some audio, and then they are required to speak in some way reflecting the input. Now, this could be done in several ways. So test takers, for example, could be asked to summarize what they've heard, in which case there could be a third element to this task. So if test takers are required to listen and hold information in their working memory and then turn that into a speaking activity, you would probably need to integrate a note-taking component into that task. So in other words, give test takers an opportunity to write down what they're hearing and then to turn that into a kind of spoken artifact later on, which will be used as the basis for assessment. Alternatively, maybe the speaking activity could be much freer. It could be a talk or a presentation, and they're required to use some of the listening as the input, so the content of their talk. Or there could be a mixed approach. So, for example, listening and reading into writing, in which case maybe a test taker reads a piece of writing, they listen to, let's say, a lecture, and then they have to turn that into a piece of writing, like a short form essay. Alternatively, reading and listening into speaking, same idea. And then an interesting thought, I don't think anyone really does this at the moment, but why not productive into receptive? We mentioned earlier when thinking about classroom-based activities for which we use mediation and integrated skills, whereby you're introducing a reading activity. Maybe, for example, you introduce schema, you introduce key vocabulary, and you have classroom-based discussion about what you're going to read. That arguably is an example of speaking into reading. So alternatively, I don't think, as I said, I don't think anybody does this much at the moment, but in theory, you could have a language test whereby you have the speaking activity first, and then you have a reading activity which follows it, and the reading activity relates to the content of the speaking activity in some way. As I say, I don't think anyone does that, but that's perfectly legitimate and a perfectly interesting and valid means of assessment. So the point is, there's a lot of different ways you can get at mediation. You can get at integrated skills. There's no specific one recipe for all of this. But what we did was very specifically to think about summary writing and to think about what is done at the moment in the literature, in common assessment practice, and think, well, how can we go about introducing, say, summary writing into a writing test? What are the implications of that? What lessons can we learn from our attempt to do this? What difficulties or challenges did we encounter attempting to do this? And that's what I'd like to talk about right now. So looking at some of the literature, I mean, we wanted to think about, well, what exactly does it mean to write a summary of a piece of text? So a reading into writing activity. So it requires a transformational approach to a piece of text in some way. So what factors can influence the difficulty of this? Suddenly we're creating a test task which is very dependent on a piece of writing, a pre-existing text. And so properties such as the organization of that text, the vocabulary contained within that text, how long that text is. And Gusheng Yu at Bristol University talks about a very interesting concept called text summarizability. So actually, I mean, some texts may be easier to summarize than others. So some texts may be very, very challenging to summarize because they don't necessarily contain main or supporting ideas. Maybe it's just one long text of main ideas or one long text of supporting ideas. So again, very, very challenging to think about, well, what does the input actually need to look like? And then, of course, you have to think about, okay, let's say we've now chosen our input text. What do we want students to do with this thing? So if you don't give students or test takers very, very clear instructions or directions as to what they're expected to do, students will struggle with these kinds of tasks. So if you just give students a text and say, summarize this, students will do very, very different things. And their output, their writing will look very, very different. And what you will almost certainly get is some very unexpected responses. So students doing things which you didn't think they would do with this input text. So you have to be very, very clear about what you want them to do. And if it's an assessment task, how they will be marked on that as well. So again, very, very clear. And good assessment practice requires students to have knowledge of assessment criteria. This is universal, whether it's single skill assessment or whether it's integrated skills assessment. Students need to know how they're being assessed and what qualities they are being assessed on. That is what fair and just language testing looks like. Okay, and then I've really mentioned this already, really, but what you expect the test takers to do with the source text. So, for example, to what extent are test takers required to paraphrase versus use original language? How much original language are they allowed to use? Because if we want to do a test of test takers' language proficiency, and we're giving them a lot of language in the input, and they just reproduce a lot of that language, to what extent can we really make a judgment about language proficiency if they are only reproducing the language they are given? So to what extent can they use the input? How far away does their own language have to be from that? And again, this is something that perhaps needs to be very clearly exemplified and clarified for students. So, for example, I mean, this is a quote from Crossley, a fairly recent one, and this is a research finding, actually. So, Crossley et al. Looked at an example of a summary task, and then they looked at high-scoring summary tasks and low-scoring summary, or responses, I should say, to summary tasks, and then tried to see, okay, in relation to the input material, what is the kind of quality difference that we can observe in high proficiency versus low proficiency? And they found that higher quality responses will include more source information through paraphrasing and sort of reorganization. So maybe they change the order of ideas. Lower quality responses rely more heavily on direct quotation and copying. So not only is the language the same, but actually the order of the information in the test taker responses was the same as in the input text as well. So again, this was really influential for us in thinking about, okay, well, how can we deal with these issues? How can we take these forwards and design a task? And then, of course, if you want to introduce, say, a summary task or an integrated skills task, you have to be very, very clear about what it is you want to assess and what skills you're targeting. And so this really is what we came up with. This is the kind of definition of integrated skills, or the kind of skills within mediation that we were looking at. So reading, for example, you can't get away from integrated skills and mediation without thinking about the kind of sub-skills. So reading, we wanted to focus on both careful, local, and global reading. So when creating a summary task, we wanted test takers to engage with the whole text, not just one or two parts of it. So students have to be able to identify the main ideas in text and then discriminate between main and supporting information. And then when it comes to writing, they have to then turn this into their own piece of writing, so creating a new text. So to do this, they have to frequently go back to the original input text and then think about how they can link ideas across the text. And then if they identify the main points, how do these main points relate to each other? And then how can they synthesize information to make their response cohesive? And then, of course, I think, which is really, really crucial, not just in summary, but in any kind of writing activity, we encourage students to goal check and to think, okay, well, I've written this, and how does this relate to the task that I'm required to complete? So to what extent have I answered the question? Have I responded to all parts of the question? Should I then check my language? Should I check my organization? In a summary, this kind of monitoring and revising is absolutely crucial. And so this is where we came to the task design. So we had to think very clearly about writing purpose. So not just actually what is being written, but who it's being written for. That was actually something that we found really important as well. When you're writing a summary, there needs to be a very clear emphasis on the audience, who you expect to read a summary. Because if you write a summary for one audience, let's say another group of learners, or you write a summary for your teacher, your summary might look quite different depending on who you're writing for. So there should always be an audience with respect to task design. And then another significant deviation from, say, an essay is, and this is where people find this kind of task quite challenging, is a summary task does not necessarily value original ideas. Whereas in an essay task, we do value original ideas. In the summary, we're asking test takers to reproduce but transform input text in some way. So we're not asking people to come up with their own ideas. So that's quite a challenge and quite a new way of looking at a writing task. And then the balance between the kinds of reading. So I mentioned search reading, careful local reading, and careful global reading as well. So to what extent can you really get at these in a summary task? How challenging is it to get the test taker to really engage with the whole text rather than just part of it? And then I've mentioned this before, who is the reader? Who is the test taker writing for? So I won't really belabor that point. But then number 4 is really, really important for us because we were very concerned about this notion of reproducibility and just reproducing the order of information. So just looking at the order of information in a text and just reproducing that. We wanted to find a way to move away from that in a summary task as well. So we thought, well, instead of just one text, why not 2 texts? So, for example, could we have an assessment task where test takers actually have to summarize 2 texts together and try and pull information from text 1 and information from text 2 and think, well, how does this information relate to each other? And can they then produce a new text which sort of combines information from both of those? So really introducing another element into this task to try and move it away from some of the challenges that we encountered so far. And then thinking about, well, okay, if we want test takers to do this, to work with more than one piece of input, how do they go about dealing with 2 separate texts? What discourse synthesis strategies will they use? So to what extent will they take information from text A, information from text B, and just present these things separately versus how well they actually integrate information across sources? So we wanted that to be part of our assessment criteria, actually. So not just the ability to extract information from text A and text B, but to show understanding of how text A and text B relate to each other. So that's actually something that we worked quite hard on. And then how do you go about scoring all of this? Well, that's really challenging. So what we're doing, and then certainly in the 1990s, there was a movement away from integrated skills tasks. So I don't know if you know this, but actually there was, in the 1990s, IELTS considered strongly actually integrating skills tasks. And IELTS used to have subject-specific tests, actually, which they stopped doing. So that was a very, very long time. Nearly 30 years ago, IELTS used to have subject-specific tests. Also, there's another problem, which we haven't really discussed so far, which is how do assessors deal with this? So think about your own marking experience for an essay, for example. Now, you read a student essay, and you have a marking criteria. So you only have to go between the student essay, the question, and the marking criteria. If you have an integrated skills task like this, reading into writing, suddenly there's a 4th element. You have, as an assessor, you have to look at the input text as well. So this imposes quite a significant cognitive load on the assessor. So an assessor has to go between the marking criteria the student response, the question, and the input texts. And in this case, 2 input texts as well. That's a lot to do. And so the assessor has to interpret and understand all of this. And then, so the assessor has to think, okay, well, to what extent is the test taker required to implement the information from the 2 texts versus to what extent they have to rely on their own language. Now, this is very, very challenging. So again, this is something that we thought quite a lot about. So I'll show you what this looks like. I think this really is perhaps in the wrong order, so I might come back to this. But if we think about the 4 skills, speaking, reading, writing, and listening, I was thinking about talking about why we wanted to do this and the importance for university-based skills. So critical text engagement, essays and lectures and seminars. But I think we've kind of covered that enough. So I won't delay this. I want to show you what these things actually look like. And so when we were thinking about writing a summary in particular, here are some crucial descriptors that led us down this path. So long complex text, we've addressed that. Interpreting content appropriately, we've addressed that. And then also the inclusion of a glossary as well to check precise meaning or unusual technical terms. And then also note that they do specify a specific audience as well. And then respecting the style and register of the original input text. So now, I don't expect you to be able to read this because that's a little bit small, but I will point out some specific elements of task design here. But this is what OUP has come up with, and this is an example of a summary task. So what you can see there are 2 input texts at the bottom of the screen. So they're relatively short. They're about 150 words each, 300 words in total. And as you can see, they are separate texts. One is from a textbook, and the other, interestingly, is actually from a lecture as well. So it's a transcript. So we've got 2 different text genres very specifically here. And then what we're requiring the test takers to do is to write a summary. Now, in most assessment tasks, there is a minimum word count. So you will have some kind of instruction that says, write at least 150 or 200 words, whatever it is. In this case, because it's a summary, we have actually introduced a maximum word count, deliberately to prevent test takers from simply reproducing everything. So that's not possible in this task. So they are given 300 words of input. They can write a maximum of 100 words in relation to this. So they have to be selective about what they're writing here. They have to extract ideas and they have to represent them in some way. Now, we mentioned it's very, very important when you're designing a task like this that the instructions for the test takers, for the students, be very, very clear. The students need to know what they're being asked to do very clearly. So here are some of the features of the inputs. As you can see, the instructions for this task are quite long, which not ideal. Ideally, you want your instructions to be fairly short and easy to understand and comprehend. But this is the best that we came up with. So first, we give them the time limit. So 20 minutes, that's not much. They have to read and write within 20 minutes. So that's quite challenging. But they do have quite a wide word count, so 80 to 100. So it's not much. They're not writing very much, but it is challenging. It is cognitively demanding. So the genre of the text will always vary. So in this example, it's the topic is psychology. And note also we have included an audience. In this case, the audience is your classmates, your fellow students. And the reason we chose that is to try and make the task as accessible as possible, so that students would know, well, I'm a member of my class, so effectively I'm writing for myself. So they don't have to think too much about the audience. Note also, we have said write 1 paragraph, so not multiple paragraphs. It's a summary, and they must use full sentences. And the reason we've done that is because when we actually trialed the task, when we first thought of it, As I mentioned, test takers came up with all sorts of imaginative ways of responding to this task. A common response was actually just to write lots and lots of bullet points. We didn't want that, because if students are writing bullet points, they're not writing full sentences, you're not really getting a sense of integration of ideas, synthesizing of ideas, and you're not getting that kind of grammatical competence of showing how you can link sentences together. So it's really, really important that we specify that we want full sentences. And it does say combine information in the text. We also say use your own words where possible. So we do accept that there will be a necessity for using text language. And this is quite important, actually, because if the texts are a fairly high level, as I said, in this case, they're about psychology. In many cases, it will not be possible for you to use your own ideas. You can't paraphrase the word psychology because psychology is a topic. So you're going to have to use the word psychology. We accept that. And then we say your summary should provide the reader with enough information to understand the main ideas. So they have to extract the main ideas from both texts and turn that into a coherent summary. Note that we have a glossary as well. So there are key words that we do gloss for test takers. Now, when it comes to marking the summary, we do take an analytic approach. But what we don't do, and this might be one of the questions that come up in the Q&A, which we'll discuss. We'll start the Q&A in a moment because we're nearly over. We don't have a separate part for reading in the criteria. Reading is integrated across the criteria. So there are reading descriptors in task fulfillment, organization, grammar, and lexis. So what we do, so presentation, task fulfillment, this is perhaps where reading is most centered. So presentation ideas, have they identified the important ideas? Are these ideas clearly explained to the reader? To what extent is there any redundancy? So have they included too much information? Have they respected the register of the original? So is it still written in the style of the original, or has it moved away a little bit? Organization. So really, really crucial. Can the reader read the test taker's response without referring back to the original input text? Does the response stand on its own? Does it make sense on its own? That's actually a quality which really distinguishes the C1 from the B2 level responses. And then the grammar and lexis. Now, what we did for grammar and lexis is we moved away from range as a criteria or in which we were judging quality. Instead, because it's only 100 words, because there's a lot of input text, we can't easily judge the range of grammatical structures being used by a test taker. Instead, what we're looking for is grammatical control, and lexical control. To what extent have the responses been written concisely? So conciseness is actually a huge element of criteria for grammar and lexis here. So for lexis, of course, what we're also doing is looking at the reliance upon the input text versus the ability to use their own language as well. So that's how we went about marking. And then I also wanted to show you this. This was really important. I mentioned previously the cognitive load on the assessors. So we thought, how can we help assessors here? What can we give assessors? So every single task that we come up with actually has what we call a task-specific marking guideline. So the assessors have one of these for every single task that they see. So what this shows is the main ideas from text 1 and text 2, and then also supporting ideas as well. So in this example, there are 3 main ideas spread across texts. Text 1 and 2. Interestingly, what this also shows you is that the structure of the tasks are not always the same. So in this example, actually, all the main ideas are present in text 2, and then the supporting information is predominantly situated in text 1. So that's not the same. In every single example, that will vary. So the reason we chose to do that is so that the test task didn't become too predictable. So, for example, there's a risk that if we just present the main idea at the top of text 1 and a main idea at the top of text 2, test takers, they can just, well, all I need to do is go to sentence 1 in text 1, sentence 1 in text 2, take these ideas, and then introduce a little bit more information, and I'm done. So actually, the main ideas are not necessarily in the first sentence in text 1 and 2. They're not necessarily spread evenly across the two texts either. So the test takers have to read really carefully to identify those main ideas. Okay, I do have some additional ideas for mediation tasks, but what I want to do at this point is to go to the Q&A, because I want to make sure that we have enough time to go through and look at some of these questions. And then if we still have a little bit of time, I don't think we will, we'll have a look at some examples of additional mediation tasks.
Okay, Nate, if you want to pop yourself onto the Q&A tab next to the chat box, there are quite a few questions in. If you're happy to pick one or two of those,
yes,
feel free. We've got
okay,
about
so
5 minutes.
Okay, so we've got a couple of questions here that I can see through. So I think a couple of them are fairly procedural. So questions about the numbers, examples of integrated tasks. Well, I hope I've done that, is give you an example of an integrated task, but we'll have a look at a couple of others in a moment to show you what they look like. And then the next one from Sonal C. These are all things you could do with a language, so they should be taught and assessed together holistically, which is how we use language in real life. Is that what you're saying? Yes, it is. Yes, I would say that's actually a very, very good way of summarizing what I've said today. In real world situations, we do use language in an integrated way, and in a classroom, we use language in integrated ways. So therefore, we should try as much as we can to create integrated assessment tasks, which represents real world activities. But as I've shown, there are enormous issues and problems that you have to overcome in order to create a really, really good integrated skills task, which don't necessarily exist in relation to more traditional assessment tasks. So yes, my argument is we should be doing this, but also I accept this is actually a really, really hard thing to do. Yeah, and then let's have a look. There's a couple of comments around the CFR. So the CFR levels build upon themselves. So something at B2 would not be expected for C1, even if it's listed. Well, yes, potentially that is possibly true. They are sort of pyramidal, if you like, so that everything that you should do at B2 is dependent on what you've built at B1 and below already. So there is an element of that. But at the same time, that doesn't necessarily explain why certain words appear at A2, then maybe disappear at B1, and then reappear at B2, and then maybe disappear again at C1. So there is a certain degree of irregularity in these descriptors. So I think that a good lesson to take away is, these things are not perfect. So they are tools to be used, not to be reified. What about watching as a fifth skill? It's an interesting one. I would quite like more information about that, what we mean by watching. But yes, I mean, watching is that comes within comprehension. But at the same time, what's really interesting about this is you're expanding beyond language as a means of cognition. And that's actually really interesting. So you're not just focusing on the language, you're focusing on visual input as well. And to what extent visual input influences language, cognition, proficiency. And that's actually really important. So I think this is really quite interesting. I suspect language testing as a discipline will move in this direction. We will try to see, okay, what other aspects of cognition can we bring in that influence language proficiency? So yes, I suspect that might happen, depending on, there are debates in artificial intelligence around what is language proficiency and the extent to which AI can ever truly replicate human cognition, because so much of large language models is dependent upon text-based input and not visual input. To what extent can AI truly be AI is a really interesting question. That is a fierce debate in AI at the moment. So that's really, really interesting. Yes, the 30K says the TOEFL IBT speaking uses these kinds of combinations. You're absolutely correct. TOEFL does a very, very good job of introducing integrated skills tasks, which is one of the reasons why OUP has moved in this direction as well. So they showed it can be done really, really well. So that's one of the reasons OUP is doing it. Which author was quoted when it comes to summarizability? That is Guoxing Yu. So Guoxing. So I know him very well, actually. So he works at the University of Bristol. So I don't know if I can write that in the chat. Yes, I think I can. So I'll just, there you go. That's how you write it, his name. But yeah, so he's written a lot on summarizability, and I think that's a really, really good point, really crucial. Veronica says, do translation and interpretation have place in mediation? The answer emphatically is yes, they do. So translation is a form of mediation. So I haven't really spoken about translation. But if you look at the CFR and if you look at a couple of the descriptors that I've included today, they use, in the descriptors, they mention language A and language B. So when you see language A and language B in the CFR, that can refer to different named languages, German, English, Spanish, Chinese, whatever. They can also refer to different genres of a single language. So, for example, taking a piece of text which is formal and rewriting it to be informal. So that can also qualify for that descriptor as well. So these descriptors should always be interpreted broadly. Okay. And then one final question. Would you say that international EFL exams are still mostly keeping to the 4 skills paradigm, or is the shift in skills assessment perception also visible there? Well, there is a shift. So we are moving, and we mentioned the TOEFL IBT. They have moved to an integrated skills. OUP is integrated skills. Pearson is more integrated skills. If Cambridge is less so, it is because IELTS is so difficult to change because it is so large. That's basically the reason why they haven't done it to date, is because it's very, very difficult to change IELTS. But generally speaking, we have moved in that direction, and we will continue to move in this direction as well. That's my prediction. So we're always thinking about how to make test tasks represent real-world activities as much as possible, so that we can claim they are valid. So validity is something we think about all the time. So yes, there's still a huge focus on 4 skills, but we are moving in that direction.
Thank you so much for that, Nate. That was wonderful.